The past and the future. It was raining torrentially in Mexico City that night. Inside the Grand Plaza Hotel, the glitter of the crystal and the reflections on the tables barely hid the tension. The corporate dinner brought together the heavyweights of the hotel industry, and amidst hurried waiters and forced laughter, Amelia Hernandez was meticulously arranging the desserts. She was barely 23, but her talent filled the table with delights. Cakes with edible flowers, reinvented Mexican sweets, tantalizing aromas. She wore a light blue apron, already stained with sugar and red fruit syrup, and she was trying to control the anxiety tightening in her chest. She knew Ramon Vargas would be there. He wasn't just any guest. He was the man. The man who, weeks earlier, had said things that were too sweet, looked at her too deeply, and made promises with the lightness of someone who doesn't understand the weight of the word tomorrow. They had had quick encounters, intense nights, kisses that seemed like they wanted to last forever, but he disappeared without warning or explanation. And now, he was there, across the room, elegant as always, in a dark suit, with a firm posture and a discreet smile. It was easy to forget him from a distance. It was hard to pretend he didn't exist now that their eyes met. Amelia felt her stomach clench. She walked slowly toward him, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She didn't want to cause a scene. She just needed to say it, to tell the truth that had been with her for weeks, growing inside her with a force she could no longer ignore. "Ramon," she said, her voice firm but low, trying to protect her dignity. He looked at her as one who sees a memory he would rather forget. There was no tenderness in that look, only surprise and a disguised impatience. "We need to talk." Ramon sighed, looked away for a moment, and with an almost automatic gesture, signaled for her to be quick. Amelia took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. "I'm pregnant." Time stopped for a second. A tense silence fell between them. The sound of the rain hitting the hotel windows grew louder. Ramon frowned as if this were an offense, and then he responded with surgical coldness. "If you're pregnant, that's your problem." It was as if a knife had gone through Amelia's heart. Every word froze a piece of her soul. She didn't cry. She just felt the ground slowly giving way beneath her. She clutched her apron tightly, turned her back, and left. She left behind the glittering ballroom, the man who now seemed a stranger, and a part of her youth that would never return. The street was cold and wet, and the wind seemed to mock any attempt to move forward. Amelia walked quickly, her apron still tied at her waist, her shoes wet, her steps firm despite her inner turmoil. The hotel ballroom was behind her, along with the phrase that kept ringing in her head. It was hard to believe those words had come from the mouth of someone who had once made her laugh in the middle of the night just because she couldn't sleep. She walked without a destination, but her body knew where to go. She needed to get out of there, to get away from him. That cold, distant, and cruel version of Ramon was not the man she had fallen in love with, and perhaps he never had been. The truth began to reveal itself with a bitter taste, like a burned dessert no one bothered to take out of the oven in time. Amelia took the subway, her hands freezing. She sat in a corner, resting her head against the window. She felt people's stares, but didn't care. Inside, she was holding the world with her two hands. There was no room for doubt anymore. She would have this baby, not because it would be easy or beautiful, or because she had a plan, but because inside her, another heart was already beating. At the final station, she got off with calmer steps. She no longer needed to run. She knew what to do. She called her Aunt Renata, who lived in San Miguel de Allende. The call was brief. "Can I go there?" The answer was filled with affection and old comfort. "This has always been your home." That night, Amelia slept to the sound of rain hitting the window. She was exhausted, yes, but not defeated. What she had lost that night wasn't her dignity. It was just an illusion. And now, as difficult as the road ahead might be, she was no longer alone. Something new was growing inside her, something that demanded care, and courage. In the following days, she organized her departure from work. She handed over her tools. She cleaned her space with care. She heard the whispers. She avoided explanations. She had quickly learned that the truth doesn't always need to be spoken to be lived. She felt no anger, just a new resolve. Her life had changed, and no one there needed to understand it. Before leaving the city, she stopped by her old pastry school. She delivered one last cake. Simple, with lavender and orange frosting, a kind of silent farewell. When the director hugged her, Amelia felt her eyes well up. But she didn't cry. She saved her tears for later, for when she was on the road where no one could see her. With her backpack on her shoulder and her belly still small, she boarded the bus toward the interior. As the capital's buildings faded, she thought about everything she wanted to build. It wouldn't be a perfect life, but it would be a true one. With every kilometer, she left behind the shadow of a love that hadn't known how to stay. And she carried with her the seed of a new future. And so, between valleys and mountains, the woman who was no longer fleeing began to be born. She was just moving forward. A new beginning. 6 years had passed since that night at the hotel. The city was still the same, with its hurried corners and glass facades. But Ramon Vargas no longer felt whole there. He had conquered everything they said was important. Award-winning hotels, signed contracts in English, gala dinners with toasts that meant nothing. But deep down, he knew it. He had lost something along the way, something no magazine cover could fill. It was for strategy, not nostalgia, that he traveled to San Miguel de Allende. The Vargas Group wanted to expand its operations with boutique hotels in the interior. The charming inn on the cobblestone street seemed perfect. Ramon arrived with his team, folders in hand, spreadsheets in his head. But it was the smell that stopped him. A soft, sweet aroma filled the air as soon as he entered. Corn with a citrusy touch. Lavender, something familiar, delicate. It wasn't just the smell of cake. It was the smell of a memory. An old night. A laugh. Of someone he had pretended to forget for a long time. Ramon walked toward the kitchen as if following an invisible thread. And there, with her back to the door, stirring a sauce with calm movements, was her. Amelia. For an instant, he didn't know what to say. His heart was beating fast, but his body remained still. She turned slowly, as if she already knew who was there. Her eyes met his, without alarm, without drama. Only with the serenity of someone who is no longer afraid. She wore a simple baker's hat, a flowery apron, and her hands were lightly stained with sugar. But what was most striking was her posture. Firm, calm, like someone who has learned to live without needing permission. "Welcome to the inn, sir," she said, with a polite smile that hid nothing and offered no more than necessary. Ramon wanted to say something, anything, but all the phrases seemed too small. No word seemed sufficient to cross those 6 years of silence. "This cake," he tried. "It smells just like that night in the capital." Amelia nodded without lowering her gaze. "It's the same one, cornbread with lavender." Some memories don't need a new recipe. The silence between the two was dense but not hostile. It was the silence of people who have a lot to say, but choose to wait. Ramon realized in that instant that she was no longer the young woman who had cried in the rain, and maybe he wasn't the same either. But that remained to be seen. For a few seconds, everything stopped. The clatter of pots in the kitchen, the hurried steps of the inn's employees, even the wind passing through the windows seemed to hold its breath. Ramon and Amelia stood there, facing each other, looking at one another with a mixture of contained fear and insistent memories. It was as if time had made a detour just to bring them back to this moment. Amelia was the first to break the silence. She turned calmly and went back to stirring the sauce on the stove, as if her heart hadn't skipped a beat. But inside, she felt everything. The old fear, the anger she had tried to bury, the nostalgia she didn't want to confess. Her body remembered the touch, the smell, what was beautiful. But her soul remembered what hurt. Ramon, on the other hand, felt like a man in front of a broken mirror. He wanted to touch it, but he feared getting cut. The woman in front of him was familiar, but also a stranger. She was stronger, more whole, and that made him even more insecure. "You're different," he dared to say in a low voice. Amelia didn't respond immediately. She just turned off the fire and put the spoon down on the counter. Then she turned to him with a serene but firm gaze. "I matured. That happens with time, and some hard knocks too." There was a long pause. It wasn't the time to talk about the past, and at the same time, everything there was about the past, about the night of the unannounced farewell, about the phrase that should never have been said, about the silence that stretched for years while a child grew up not knowing half of his story. "Why did you disappear?" she asked without anger. The question was soft but sharp. Ramon lowered his gaze. He wanted to explain, but he knew there was no fair justification, only cowardice, only fear, only a young man who still carried too many ghosts from his own childhood. "I wasn't ready, and I was an idiot." "You were?" she confirmed without bitterness. "But that didn't stop me from moving forward." Ramon felt a lump in his throat. There was so much he wanted to ask, so much he wanted to know. But in that instant, he understood that she owed him nothing. The reunion wasn't a free pass to rescue the past. It was a reminder. She was alive, she was well, and she no longer needed his approval. The look they exchanged then wasn't romantic or distant. It was a look in suspense, full of unspoken things. Broken promises, feelings that still didn't know where to belong. And in the back of the kitchen, amidst pots, dried flowers and cooling cakes, a question hung in the air. How did their lives separate like that? What really happened that night? Before the pain, before the cruel phrase, there was beauty. It was on a warm afternoon, at a new restaurant launch event, on the terrace of one of the city's luxury hotels. Amelia was there for work, carrying a tray of mini desserts, while Ramon circulated among the guests like someone carrying the world on his shoulders and not wanting anyone to notice. The first glance was quick, almost distracted, but it was enough. There was something in the way she held the sweets, with an almost maternal care that caught his attention. And in him, what surprised her was the discreet smile he gave when he tasted one of the desserts. It wasn't the smile trained for photos. It was another, more authentic, almost shy one. "This flavor has something of my childhood," he said, taking another sweet. Amelia smiled back lightly. "It's corn with condensed milk and lemon zest, my grandmother's recipe. Memories help give things flavor." That's how it all began, simply, almost without pretense. In the following days, Ramon appeared at the pastry shop where Amelia was doing her internship, first as a customer, then as someone curious, then as a man who wanted to understand why that young woman with the soft voice and sweet hands wouldn't leave his mind. The encounters were brief but intense. A hurried coffee before meetings, a drive to her house just to talk, a night when they both escaped a dinner with important people and ate tacos in a random plaza, laughing without fear. Ramon allowed himself to slowly disarm. Amelia, despite her distrust, began to believe that something good could happen there. He spoke little of his family, avoided topics that touched on old wounds, but Amelia noticed the effort, how he tried to listen more, to be present, to offer something more than money. And she, without understanding the reason for so much silence at times, accepted the mystery. Not everyone knows how to love in the same way, she thought. But there was a rush, as if their time was borrowed. Ramon had commitments, trips, pressures. Amelia had her feet on the ground and knew that fairy tales don't usually last in the real world. Still, she gave in. Not out of naivety, but out of choice. The romance was brief, but left its marks. A caress on her face, a note hidden in a box of sweets, a rainy night when he promised he'd be back soon. And then, the silence, without warning, without explanation, just absence. Amelia waited, called once, twice. Then she stopped, because she knew that whoever wants to show up will, and whoever loves doesn't disappear at the first turn. The sweet turned bitter, and that's how a beautiful meeting became a memory that, years later, would still smell of lavender and taste of nostalgia. Ramon grew up between glass walls and long silences. The only son of a hotel empire, he learned early on that emotions were weaknesses and that affection was kept in invisible chests. His mother left when he was still wearing a school uniform. No letter, no warning, no explanation. His father, a tough and implacable man, taught him that the world was a jungle and that feeling too much was asking to be devoured. Ramon learned, swallowed the pain, encased his heart. So, when Amelia sought him out that night in the Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom, telling him she was pregnant, the abandoned child inside him screamed even before the man could think. It wasn't calculation, it was a reflex. And what came out of his mouth was the coldest phrase he could say. If you're pregnant, that's your problem. He didn't realize it at the time, but that moment was a mirror. Amelia, with eyes full of tears and a trembling voice, looked like the woman who had abandoned him years ago, saying without saying, "You're on your own." Ramon didn't know how to separate the past from the present. He just wanted to protect himself. The pressure of business also weighed on him. That week, he was facing a delicate negotiation with foreign investors. Any scandal, any distraction could ruin everything. And he had learned to never lose. Amelia represented a risk, even though she carried something that was also his. But at that moment, he didn't want to know. After she left, Ramon stood there for a few minutes, holding a glass that no longer tasted of anything. He tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing, that he couldn't let emotion get in the way of reason. But the emptiness began there, discreetly, almost imperceptibly, like an echo in an empty room. In the following days, he immersed himself in work. He signed contracts, traveled abroad, smiled for photos, shook hands. But inside, something began to hurt. It wasn't regret yet. It was discomfort, like a new shoe that doesn't hurt at first, but begins to chafe little by little. Amelia disappeared from the radar, changed her number, deleted herself from social media, left no trace. Ramon didn't look for her, because he knew that if he found her, he would have to face not only her, but the worst part of himself. And so the cruel decision was relegated to a dark corner of his memory, as if forgetting it were possible, as if a child, even an invisible one, wouldn't cast a shadow on sunny days. But time is stubborn. It holds what needs to be faced, And one day, without warning, it returns with everything. The bus swayed slowly down the highway, as if it knew Amelia needed time to breathe. With every kilometer, the tall buildings were left behind, giving way to open fields, distant mountains, and picturesque towns. It was as if the world was changing its rhythm, and so was she. San Miguel de Allende appeared on the horizon like a breath of fresh air, with its stone streets, earth-colored walls, and old doors with flowers in the windows. Amelia got off with a small suitcase, a backpack on her back, and the heaviest decision she had ever carried: to start from scratch. Her Aunt Renata was waiting for her at the bus station with the same old embrace. Strong, full of comforting silence. There were no questions in that first meeting, just welcome, just hot tea, the room arranged, the phrase said with affection, "You can breathe here." In the first few days, Amelia slept like someone who needed to disconnect from the world. She cried little, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain was deep, silent, like a knot that didn't know how to untangle itself. Little by little, she began to walk the neighborhood streets, looking at shop windows, smelling the aroma of bakeries, and listening to the laughter of children playing in the squares. That city seemed to be in no hurry for anyone. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It came in small gestures. Renata invited her to help in the inn's kitchen. At first, Amelia hesitated, but she soon realized that the manual work brought her peace. Kneading dough, sifting sugar, decorating a loaf of bread, all of it occupied her mind, filled the empty spaces. It was there that the idea for the workshop was born. One day, as she was preparing cookies with dried flowers, Renata commented, "You have hands that heal." And it was like a spark. Amelia began to jot down names, try out recipes, and listen to the stories of the neighborhood women. Flor de Sal wasn't born as a business. It was born as a place of healing, for her and for anyone who walked through the door. Her belly grew slowly, and with it, her courage. Amelia began to smile again, to sing softly while she cooked, to make simple plans. She didn't think about Ramon. He wasn't part of the present. The focus now was the baby, the child who would come without a father, but with much love. The birth of Joaquin was quiet, surrounded by neighbors who showed up with flowers, soups, and prayers. He came into the world with curious eyes and a loud cry. Amelia looked at him and felt something that no past pain could erase. She had done the right thing, even with fear, even alone, even hurt. San Miguel became her home, not because it was perfect, but because it offered what the big city had never given her: space to start over without the need for explanations. And it was in that land, between the aroma of fresh bread and the orange-skied afternoons, that Amelia began to flourish again. The room was simple, with butter-colored walls and a window that let the morning sun in silently. Amelia prepared everything with care, even on a tight budget. She embroidered the name Joaquin on a wall cloth, sewed his own sheets, and filled the space with small handmade details. She didn't need luxury, only tenderness, and she had plenty of that. The birth was serene, with a neighborhood midwife, whispered prayers, and Aunt Renata's firm hand holding her. When Joaquin cried for the first time, Amelia cried with him, but it was a different kind of crying, not of sadness, but of wonder. Wonder at seeing there, in her arms, a being so small and already so full of life. A miracle, a piece of her that was now breathing on its own. In the first few days, everything was new. The sleepless nights, the fear of making a mistake, the crying she didn't yet know how to decipher, but also the involuntary smiles, the delicate yawns, the way he held her finger so tightly. Joaquin became the center of everything. Time was organized around him. Amelia created a light routine, almost like a dance. In the morning, she would play soft music in the kitchen and knead the bread dough while Joaquin slept in his makeshift crib near the stove. In the afternoon, they would walk in the square. Him in a carrier, her with her hair tied up any old way, and the calm look of someone who has found a new rhythm. At night, she would tell him stories, invented or remembered from her childhood, just to see his little eyes slowly close. Little by little, the Flor de Sal workshop grew with him. Neighbors began to ask for cakes for birthdays, cookies for parties, and bread for breakfast. Joaquin was a constant presence, in arms, on a rug, next to the counter, then crawling among baskets of flour. The customers would laugh. "This child will know how to bake before he can walk." The home Amelia built was not made of solid walls or expensive furniture. It was made of care, goodnight kisses, warm milk with cinnamon, hugs when the world hurt, and the silent commitment to raise that child away from the weight of resentment. She didn't talk about Ramon, not because she wanted to hide the past, but because she decided that Joaquin would grow up without that empty feeling, decorating every phrase. When he asked, she would have answers. But for now, the present was enough. And so it was that, among new recipes, scribbled notebooks, and toys scattered across the living room, Amelia became not just a mother, but a different woman. Stronger, more complete and sweeter, even with all her scars. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive like thunder. It arrives like an oven turned on at the end of the afternoon, spreading warmth throughout the house. The flashes exploded in front of him. Smiles were repeated. Ramon cut inauguration ribbons, shook important hands, and spoke with firmness to audiences dressed in formal wear. He was the face behind the expansion of the Arriaga Group. The boy who had inherited his father's empire was now the man who was making it grow. More hotels, more profits, more awards, but every victory was accompanied by a silence no one heard. Behind the scenes, Ramon's life was made of airport hallways, cold meals in hotel rooms, and long meetings where everyone said yes, afraid of contradicting him. His schedule was impeccable, his reputation flawless, but inside, his soul was walking barefoot, stumbling in the empty spaces that success couldn't fill. He vaguely remembered what made him laugh. It had been a long time since he had danced on impulse, cooked something simple, or listened to music without thinking about spreadsheets. It was as if life had become a stage, and he was the main actor in a play that no longer made sense. Sometimes he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. The impeccable suit, the expensive watch, the well-combed hair, everything was in its place, except him. When he took off his shoes at night in a luxury apartment overlooking the city, the silence was so loud it almost hurt. Once, after an awards ceremony in Los Cabos, Ramon stood watching the fireworks reflected in the sea. Everyone was celebrating. He wasn't. That grand scene only reinforced what he already knew. What really mattered wasn't there. Something was missing that he couldn't name, but that he felt every day, amidst the travel, the applause, and the spreadsheets. It was Don Julian, his mentor and almost adoptive father, who noticed it first. "Son," he said without mincing words, "there are victories that cost entire houses inside you." Ramon remained silent. He didn't know how to respond, but he kept that phrase like someone who keeps a key to a door he hasn't yet had the courage to open. In the following months, the discomfort grew. He started avoiding social dinners. He preferred the silence of the car to the bustle of events. He started remembering things he didn't want to. The broken childhood, the woman who left, the girl with the sweets who disappeared after a cruel phrase. It was as if everything he had swept under the rug was starting to push back. And then, the news of Don Julian's death came like a punch. It made the world even quieter. Don Julian's wake was discreet, just as he would have liked. No expensive flowers, no long speeches, just a few simple chairs, the sound of a guitar in the background, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Ramon arrived alone, in a dark suit with sunken eyes. Almost no one recognized him there. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the businessman. He was just a man in mourning. Don Julian was not his relative, but he was the closest thing to family. He was the former manager of one of the family's hotels. A calm man, with a firm way of speaking and a rare laugh. It was he who taught Ramon the value of time, of listening, of silence. When Ramon was just a boy, trying to pretend he didn't feel pain, it was Don Julian who would show up with hot chocolate and a simple phrase. "You don't need to be strong all the time, kid." The loss of his mentor was not a shock. His health had been fragile for months, but it still hurt. It hurt because with him, Ramon lost a piece of his own humanity. One of the few people who knew him for who he really was, without a mask, without a suit, without medals. After the burial, Don Julian's widow approached him with a yellowed envelope. On it, only one phrase was written by hand on the front, for when he loses himself. Ramon put the paper in his pocket, but he didn't open it that day. He needed courage. It was days later, alone at home, that he finally broke the seal. The letter was brief, but every line seemed to have been written with meticulous care. "Ramon, if you are reading this, it's because you have grown tired of winning alone. Take care of what really matters. The world applauds you for your conquests, but who will be by your side when the lights go out? Do not repeat your father's mistakes. Do not try to protect yourself from love. You deserve a full life, not just a title. With affection, Julian." Ramon read slowly. Then he read it again. He felt his throat tighten, his eyes sting. That wasn't just a note. It was a mirror. He had spent his life trying to be invincible. But what Don Julian made clear was simple. No one needs to be invincible. They need to be true. The letter stayed on the table for days. Every time he passed by, he would read it again. There were no more excuses, no room for escape. It was time to face what he had left behind. What, or who, really mattered. That night, Ramon didn't go to any event. He did something he hadn't done in a long time. He turned off his cell phone, poured a glass of wine, and looked inward. And in the silence of the room, for the first time in years, he began to ask himself who he was when no one else was looking. Ramon never imagined he would walk into a therapy office. For him, that kind of thing was always for weak people. Or so he learned from his father. But after Don Julian's letter, the silence inside him became impossible to ignore. It was like living with a constant ringing in his chest. And so, in the same old suit, but with a slower step, he went up the stairs to the psychologist's office recommended by an old friend. The room was small but cozy. Cushions, soft yellow light, the scent of lavender. Not too different from Amelia's pastry shop, although he didn't yet know how symbolic that would be. The therapist, Jimena Robles, had a calm voice and eyes that didn't judge. In the first meeting, Ramon barely spoke. He sat with his back straight, his hands clasped, and his gaze fixed on a random spot. "Why did you come?" she asked without rushing. "Someone who knew me well said I was losing myself," he answered, almost in a whisper. In the first few meetings, Ramon spoke little. He said he was tired, that things no longer had the same flavor, that he felt an emptiness in his chest that he couldn't even explain. Jimena didn't pressure him. She just listened. And little by little, without him realizing it, the walls began to crack. In time came memories of his childhood, the door of his room closing, his mother leaving without a goodbye, his father saying, "Swallow your tears." Confessions also came, the fear of disappointing, the guilt for what he said to Amelia, the emptiness that no victory could fill. Ramon heard himself for the first time, and he didn't like what he heard. Jimena patiently pointed out patterns. She spoke of escape, of emotional armor, of the habit of turning everything into a task, even feelings. Ramon resisted, saying he needed to control things, that trusting others was opening the door to being hurt. She just returned the question, "But who are you punishing with that?" It was in one of those meetings that he talked about Amelia's pregnancy for the first time, without justifications. He simply told the story, and when he finished, he broke down. Jimena said nothing for a few seconds, then commented simply, "You weren't ready to love, and you confused love with a threat, but to love is also to grow." That phrase hammered in his head for days. To love is also to grow. And Ramon began to understand that it wasn't too late, that he could still choose another path. But for that, he would have to take off the armor, step by step, gesture by gesture. There was no magic solution. The process hurt. Revisiting old wounds, taking responsibility, asking for forgiveness. But was that the alternative to continuing to be a stranger in his own life? And deep down, Ramon already knew he no longer wanted to keep running. Ramon entered the inn with his team, pretending to be completely focused on the work. It was easier to hide his heart behind spreadsheets. The facade of the place was charming, the architecture well preserved, and the city's atmosphere seemed calmer than he remembered. But what really paralyzed him was the smell. It was sweet, warm, with a citrusy touch that cut through the air like a living memory. Corn and orange, maybe lavender too. He stopped in the middle of the hallway, like someone who rediscovers a place he has never been to, but already knows. "Shall we go into the kitchen?" a staff member asked, trying to keep the presentation on track. Ramon nodded, but he barely heard the rest of the explanation. When he crossed the door, everything made sense at once. She was there. Amelia had her back to him, placing a tray on the wooden counter, her apron flowered, her hair tied back in a practical way, her movements precise. Even without seeing her face, Ramon knew. That woman was the same one he had left 6 years ago, but at the same time, she was different. She turned calmly, as if she already knew it was him. There was no surprise. There was firmness. Her gaze didn't waver. His? Yes, it did. "Good morning," she said simply. "Would you like to try the cake?" The group looked at Ramon, waiting for the boss's answer. He swallowed and walked to the tray. He took a small piece with his fingers, tasted it, and in that second, he was back in the past. It was the same taste as the first night they spent together, the same one she had prepared with a shy gesture, wanting to please without looking like she was trying too hard. He chewed slowly, not for the flavor, but for the memory. "This cake," he said in a low voice, "tastes like something I tried to forget." Amelia smiled slightly, without irony, without provocation. "Food has that power. It makes you remember even what you pretended didn't exist." Ramon looked at her, trying to understand how she could be so different, and yet exactly the same. And in that instant, he understood something that therapy had been trying to tell him for weeks. Certain absences aren't filled with apologies, only with presence. In the small kitchen, with the aroma of the cake still in the air and their gaze fixed on that reunion, Ramon understood that the past doesn't disappear. It bakes slowly, like a bread that only rises at the right time. At the end of that afternoon, with the golden light coming through the inn's windows, Ramon asked to speak alone. Amelia hesitated, but agreed. They went to the backyard, where the grass grew freely and the smell of dry herbs filled the air under the sun. She crossed her arms, firm. He seemed older than she remembered, but maybe it was just undigested guilt. Ramon took a few seconds to start talking. He fidgeted with his hands, as if looking for courage in his fingers. I wanted to know if I can meet my son." The phrase hung in the air. Amelia didn't react immediately. She just looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and weariness. It wasn't an automatic response. It was a question loaded with everything that had been lived and everything that had been denied. She took a deep breath. "Do you know what that means?" she asked in a quiet but firm voice. "I want to become a part of his life, somehow. I want to try." Amelia went over to an iron chair and sat down, like someone who needs to steady their body to order their soul. Then she pointed to the ground in front of her, and Ramon understood the gesture. "You sit down too. Listen, Ramon, I raised Joaquin alone. Every fever, every birthday, every fear of school. I sang him to sleep. I held his hand when he fell off his bike. He knows what love is. He knows what presence is. So, if you're thinking of showing up and disappearing again, don't even try." He lowered his gaze, swallowing. The shame was real, but so was the desire to do things differently. "I know I failed, and I know I can't make up for everything. I want the opportunity to show that I can change." Amelia watched every word. She saw no arrogance there. She saw fear, maybe true regret. Still, it wasn't enough. "There's no room for empty promises here, Ramon. If you want to meet Joaquin, you'll have to do it calmly, with respect, with time. He's not a mistake to be fixed. He's a child with feelings, and I'm his mother, and I'll protect him with everything I have." She stood up, took a vase of rosemary from the ledge of the wall, and held it like a shield. "Now you walk through the door of my house as a visitor. If one day you are family, it will be because of daily choices, not because of a last name." Ramon nodded slowly. It wasn't the easiest answer, but it was a fair one. And in that instant, he knew that the true beginning was there, in that honesty that hurt. But there would be room for something new. Ramon returned to San Miguel the following week, and the next, and the one after that, always with some excuse for the team. A contract review, a technical visit, a feasibility analysis. But deep down, he knew it. What was bringing him back wasn't the inn. It was a child with curious eyes who still didn't know who he was. Amelia kept the rules clear. No forced meetings. No, "This is your father," out of the blue. Ramon would have to earn his place, not with expensive gifts or pretty speeches, but with time, the most valuable asset he had learned to neglect. The first meeting was in the park, under the clear sky of a Saturday morning. Joaquin was with a kite shaped like a jaguar, running among the trees, laughing out loud. Ramon sat on a bench, watching from a distance. When Amelia approached with the boy by the hand and said, "This is Mr. Ramon. He works with hotels," Joaquin just nodded and went back to running. And so it was for a while. Silences, glances from afar, timid approaches. But the magic lies in the details. The following week, Ramon brought a new kite. He didn't say it was a gift. He just commented, "This one has a firmer structure. It flies better against the wind." Joaquin accepted it with a smile, and the two spent the afternoon seeing which of the two went higher. Then came the simple conversations about clouds that looked like dragons, about ice cream flavors, about how a parrot learns to repeat words. Joaquin was curious, intelligent, and had a way of looking directly into your eyes, as if he could see the truth before it was spoken. Ramon began to put his cell phone on airplane mode when he arrived, sat on the floor of the pastry shop with the boy, and decorated animal-shaped cookies. He brought books with stories from other cultures and read aloud. When Joaquin called him Mr. Ramon from the hotel for the first time, he felt a knot in his chest. It was little, but it was a start. Amelia watched everything carefully. She didn't interfere, but she saw. And what she saw was different. Ramon wasn't trying to buy anything. He was trying to learn to be present, to have patience, to listen without interrupting, things he had never been taught, but that a 6-year-old boy was now teaching him. The bonds began to grow slowly, like plants that need sun and silence. Ramon never asked when he could see him again. He simply said, "I'll be here on Saturday if he wants to go to the park." And he always was, even on rainy days, even when work was pressing. One day, at the end of the afternoon, Joaquin took his hand to cross the street. He didn't say anything. He just took it. And in that small gesture, Ramon felt something big being born. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was an invitation. The proposal was ambitious. An American chain wanted to sign with the Vargas Group to expand its hotels in Miami, New York, and maybe even outside the United States. It was the kind of contract that would place Ramon's name among the greats of the international sector. The meetings had lasted for months. The date for the signing was confirmed with great fanfare. September 14th. The same day Joaquin would turn 7. Ramon received the confirmation email and felt his body tense. He read the message 3 times. The plane was already booked. The executives were anxious. The lawyers were finalizing the last clauses. But his heart felt heavy. That same day, Amelia had invited him simply. "We're making a little cake with the kids from school. There's going to be a music presentation. He'll sing Cielito Lindo. Nothing special, but it would be good if you came." Ramon said he would try, but then he fell silent. In the days that followed, the doubt grew like a thorn. It was just one signature, a 2-day trip. He could come back and make up for it. Maybe bring a better gift. Joaquin would understand. Kids are flexible, right? But a part of him knew. Some absences aren't fixed with expensive memories. In his therapy session that week, he finally spoke. "I don't know what to choose. If I miss this meeting, I could lose the most important contract of my life. But if I miss the party, maybe I'll lose something else, something I can't even name." Jimena, the therapist, listened carefully. Then she asked, "What will weigh more in 10 years? The signed contract or the song he sang looking at the door, hoping you'd be there?" Ramon didn't answer. He couldn't. But the question kept echoing until the eve of the party. On the morning of the 14th, he was at the top of a skyscraper in Sao Paulo, from where he would make the call to board the flight to Miami. The car was waiting for him at the door. He held the pen he would use to sign the contract. He looked out the window and saw the reflection of his own face in the glass, impeccable on the outside, restless on the inside. He took a deep breath. He picked up the phone. He called his partner. "Postpone the signing. Tell them there was an unforeseen event. I'll be in Miami after the weekend." And then, without big speeches, he got into the car and changed his destination. He arrived at Flor de Sal when the candles were already lit. The children were singing. Amelia looked at him, surprised but relieved. Joaquin turned slowly, like someone who still couldn't believe it. Ramon, out of breath, took a small package from his pocket. Simple paper tied with a string. He walked over, knelt down to the boy's level, and said, "I'm sorry I wasn't there for all your birthdays, but I came today, and I brought you this. I made it myself." Joaquin opened the package carefully. It was a hand-carved wooden airplane, with rustic but well-done details. Ramon had learned to make it from Don Efrain, a local artisan from the market. It took him weeks and several cuts on his fingers. But there it was, a gift you couldn't buy in any store. The boy looked at him, then at the plane, then at both of them. And then, with a simple and genuine gesture, he threw himself into Ramon's arms and hugged him tightly. "I knew you'd come," he said in a low voice. Ramon closed his eyes, hugging his son tightly, like someone hugging the whole world. And in that embrace, he knew that no contract in the world was worth more than that moment. After the birthday, things didn't turn into a fairy tale. There was no happily ever after with violins or rushed promises of a perfect new beginning. But there was something more rare: consistency. Ramon started visiting San Miguel every week, not to impress, but to participate. And Amelia, little by little, allowed that closeness. He learned her routine. He took Joaquin to school, picked him up, and helped with his homework. He learned the names of his friends. He went to parent-teacher meetings. He sat on the benches in the square just to listen to the boy talk about planets, airplanes, and sweets. Every gesture was a seed, small but firm. With Amelia, the rhythm was different. They spoke with respect, with care, like two adults who knew the value of scars. She didn't melt with pretty words. She wanted to see decisions, actions, normal days. Ramon understood, and he wasn't in a hurry. One afternoon, Amelia called him to talk on the inn's balcony. The sun was setting slowly, and the aroma of fresh bread came from the kitchen. She was calm but direct. "I've been thinking about something. Aunt Renata's inn is growing, and so is the workshop. We're getting more guests and more orders than we can handle on our own. I've thought about making room for a partnership, but I don't want help or charity. I want structure, transparency, and shared control." Ramon listened carefully. He didn't interrupt her. He just asked, "What do you propose?" Amelia took a simple folder from her bag with a draft contract. It had clear goals, limited percentages, a board with 3 neighborhood women to ensure the project's identity wasn't lost, and clauses that protected the artisanal rhythm of the kitchen. "If you want to come in, this is how it is. I don't want a boss. I want a partner who builds with me," she said, looking him in the eyes. Ramon read everything carefully. Then he nodded. "I accept. No bargaining, no changing a line. Because to love is also to respect what the other person has built without you." That night, there were no kisses. There was trust, and that was more valuable than any declaration. They weren't trying to go back to what they were. They were creating something new, more mature, more sincere. And in the silence at the end of the day, with Joaquin sleeping and the cakes cooling by the window, Amelia felt for the first time that the past no longer hurt so much, because the present was being taken care of with truth. It was a quiet morning in San Miguel, the sky effortlessly blue, and the air smelled of wet earth and sweet bread. Joaquin was running in the inn's garden with a kite in his hands, his hair in the wind, and a light laugh that had already become the soundtrack to the mornings there. The bougainvillea in the courtyard was blooming in intense pink tones, scattering petals on the ground as if time had decided to celebrate. Ramon watched from a distance, sitting on a wooden bench. He wore a simple shirt with the sleeves rolled up and held a small package in his pocket. There was no rush or rehearsal, just certainty. The certainty that the road there had been hard, but necessary. He was no longer the man who fled. He was the one who chose to stay. Amelia came out of the kitchen with a cloth on her shoulders and a smile on her lips. She sat beside him without saying anything. They stayed there for a while, just watching Joaquin play, breathing together, sharing the good silence of people who no longer need to explain themselves. "Do you remember that rainy afternoon when you told me this place was your workshop?" Ramon asked suddenly. Amelia nodded. "I never forgot it, and I think I learned with you that loving is a craft, made with patience, with a firm hand, with intention." He took a small wooden box from his pocket, simple, aged at the edges. Inside, there was a handmade silver ring with a small engraving of lavender in the center. The same artisan who taught him to carve Joaquin's airplane had made it. "I don't want this to be a story's ending or a repair. I want it to be a beginning, another one that we choose, slowly, every day. You, Joaquin, and I, a family that takes care of each other without fading away." Amelia looked at the ring, then at him, and she didn't cry, because it wasn't about uncontrolled emotion. It was peace, the knowledge that this time it wasn't a promise. It was a stance, a choice, a love with roots. She took the ring carefully. She held it in the palm of her hand and responded with a voice that was firm but sweet. "We don't get married to forget the past. We get married when the present shows that we have learned from it." They decided to celebrate in the neighborhood chapel, with flowers from the market, music from Joaquin's school choir, and orange and lavender cake. No luxury, no rush, just truth. And so, under the bougainvillea that continued to shed petals like blessings, a commitment was sealed that didn't depend on glitter, but on the gesture. Because true love isn't what erases the wounds. It's what transforms regret into presence. It's what chooses to care, even when it would be easier to flee. In the heart of Mexico, in a house with the oven on and the windows open, a family learned that what truly flourishes needs to be cultivated every day.